I'm pleased to welcome you today to the second David Bradford Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment seminar of this semester. Today, I'm particularly delighted to introduce Dr. Michael Davidson, who is an assistant professor at UC, University of California, San Diego, at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department of the Jacobs School of Engineering. Michael's research focuses on the engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying renewable energy at scale. He's particularly interested in systems within emerging electricity markets, including China and India, as well as within the United States. Davidson was previously the US-China Climate Policy Coordinator for the environmental nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council. He's also a former Fulbright Scholar and has received fellowships from the MIT Energy Initiative and the Martin Family Society of Fellows for Sustainability. Prior to joining UC San Diego, Davidson was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources program. He received his PhD in engineering systems at the MIT Institute for Data Systems and Society. He also holds a Master's of Science in Technology and Policy from MIT and undergraduate degrees from Case Western Reserve University. While at MIT, he was part of the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change and a member of the Tsinghua MIT China Energy and Climate Project. He's also currently a fellow with the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, hosted at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and with the Public Intellectuals Program at the National Committee on US-China Relations. Today, he will speak with us about decarbonization decision-making in the Western United States under political uncertainty. For questions as we go along, please put them in the question and answer box at the bottom edge of your Zoom screen, and I'll choose among them and call on you at the end for further discussion. Dr. Davidson, we look forward to your seminar. Please take it away.
All right, thanks, Denise, and thanks for the invitation. I was very delighted to be here with you all today. As Denise mentioned, I'm working on the intersection of a number of different topics in energy systems and geographies. So I'll be talking about the Western United States work today. So I'd like to start with just giving a little bit of background on what we do here at the lab, because I think it's interesting to think about how we can bring different types of engineering as well as other models and theories of how energy systems and energy transitions occur. So I use quite a bit of engineering economic models. We do that in our lab with some electricity systems optimization, which we'll be talking about today, renewable resources. We also think about how low carbon infrastructure planning is influenced by incumbent energy institutions. And so this brings us to more of a discussion around the political economy of energy transitions. So thinking about particularly how markets are created in different contexts, and then also doing some more case study work on how low carbon transitions take place, for example, in state-owned enterprises. And as mentioned, I focus on China and India, and then more recently working on the Western United States, where, as you'll see, we also have some really interesting market developments happening. So a number of members of our lab. This work is joint with my postdoc, C-PREE, Kuchuksai Chigio, who is on the job market. Excellent. And also we're going to be thinking about some political economy extensions of this with Nikki Imam, who's a student here at GPS. Great. So, what is the Western United States decarbonization challenge? Well, first of all, we know that the United States, we have a lot of state-led climate policy. So just looking at what states have passed either through executive action or legislation, greenhouse gas targets, explicit greenhouse gas reduction targets or carbon neutrality targets, you see it's a patchwork. We have no federal GHG target. And as a result, states have kind of embraced their own set of guidelines and policies. These state-level policies vary, driven in large part by the state-level politics in terms of the stringency of the targets. Are they reaching net zero, or do they have 80% reduction, 40% reduction? What sectors are they covering? Technology preferences, for example, in the use of various clean energy standards or renewable portfolio standards. We do know that if we're going to go this state-led climate policy route, that we do need to have lower barriers to interstate electricity trade. That is one of the things that have been identified by various numbers of models as a cost-effective and necessary measure to enable this bottom-up climate policy. So here in the Western United States, we have what's called the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, or WEC. It's one of the reliability regions under NERC, and it takes up these 11 states in the US and then parts of Canada and Mexico. And a number of studies that have looked at just reaching net zero in the Western power grid have identified that enhanced coordination across the region can really help to achieve this cost effectively. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is variable renewable energy, so think solar and wind. The resource quality varies quite a bit across the West. You want to be able to access the best sites of those resources. You also want to have transmission interconnection across the region that can help balance load as well as balance the renewables. And they need to have some kind of coordination mechanisms to enable this short-term energy balancing, as well as sharing reserves or backup generation in the case that you have forecast inaccuracies. We also have a hodgepodge of utilities and utility structures and regulatory structures in the West. So we have 38 balancing areas that are in charge of managing this generation and load, as well as interchanges between the balancing areas. We have hundreds of utilities owning and operating assets. It's actually quite hard to figure out the exact number just in this region, but it's in the hundreds. We have 11 different state public utility commissions with various responsibilities in terms of resource adequacy, retail rate regulation, and others. And we know that there are a lot of benefits to increased coordination along a number of dimensions. First off, you can reduce production costs and transaction costs associated with accessing cheaper resources that are outside of your balancing area, for example. Increase grid flexibility to respond to various variability in renewables. Coordinating transmission planning, and importantly, resource adequacy, which is having a sufficient amount of generation available to meet peak demand over this year and several years looking ahead. And then reducing renewable energy curtailment, which can occur when you have too much, for example, solar on the system and the grid, there's insufficient demand or transmission evacuation capacity or flexibility in other resources to accommodate it, and you end up wasting the renewables. So there's a lot of benefits that we could see from enhancing coordination in these Western states. One model of this is what's called regionalization, and in particular, creating what's called a regional transmission organization, or an RTO. And there is a somewhat esoteric distinction between RTOs and ISOs that we don't need to get into today, an ISO independent system operator. So for the purpose here, I'm going to just talk about RTOs. And RTOs have a large number of coordinating functions across the various utilities that are involved in it. One is energy and ancillary services markets. So a single market that is able to clear across the whole RTO. Coordinated transmission expansion planning within the region to identify what are the lowest cost and most cost-effective ways to achieve resource expansion and meeting demand. You can look at resource adequacy across a much larger area. So taking into account the fact that everyone's demand doesn't peak at the same time, and so you don't necessarily need to build so much extra capacity. And then they usually have some kind of regional governance structures to organize how the structure of these markets and the planning process, the stakeholder input. And a couple of studies, the most recent one, which was one actually initiated by several Western states, funded by the DOE, looked at what are the benefits of creating RTO, and they pegged it at around 1.3 billion in overnight benefits. That is, if we kind of built it tomorrow, what would be the benefits? And those costs could potentially grow over time as you build more assets and when thinking about retiring and where you need to build from there. Importantly, we don't have the answer in that and other studies is how important the RTO is to decarbonization of the West. We do know we can save lots of production costs. But we have a sense that maybe the RTO is quite important for achieving various renewable energy integration goals. But how important is it? And that's going to be what I'm going to be talking about today. So just a quick overview of the talk. We'll go through some Western policies and grid infrastructure, get to the research question, and then go into the methodology where we talk about the model that we developed, an optimization capacity expansion planning model, and then go through some preliminary results and kind of discussions about how we think about the politics going forward. So first off, we know that state policies for clean energy are quite varied. So this is just a map of state level clean energy policies, so renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards. And you can see that, well, there are 2 Western states that don't have any policies, and then the other states have quite varied in terms of where their targets are, how far ahead in the future are they looking? Are they just looking out the next 5-10 years, or they actually have a mid-century target, et cetera? So here is it by the numbers, and in particular, important to know that there's this renewable portfolio standard. So getting all of the RPS met by renewable energy versus a clean energy, which would include non-renewable sources like nuclear. So states don't align on the targets, on the timetables, or even what kinds of technologies should be included in their policy targets. We identified 16 interstate transmission projects that are different stages of planning. This was not trivial, surprisingly, because transmission projects can come in from lots of different processes, and you have different stages, and some can take more than a decade to be built. So we went on and we collected the various transition projects that are underway in order to incorporate them directly into our long-term model, and also give us a sense of where we might be able to expand and upgrade transmission. So given how varied the Western United States is in terms of the policies and politics around clean energy, electricity markets, and climate policy, a number of what you could call regionalization light or politically feasible organizations are forming, mostly between utilities. So the first is the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which I'll be talking about here, but we also have some other ones, including kind of a competitor energy imbalance market offered by the Southwest Power Pool. And then there are some more targeted programs aimed, for example, at resource adequacy. The Western Energy Imbalance Market is a really interesting example because it's operated by the California Independent System Operator, but it is not an extension of the full California Independent System Operator. So that's why we call it Regionalization Light. So it has a real-time energy market, which can deal with some of the balances, solar and wind, varying, and being able to use, for example, hydropower up in the Northwest a little bit more efficiently to balance. But it preserves the autonomy of all these different balancing authorities to choose voluntarily, do they want to participate in this market, but then ultimately they are going to be scheduling their generation and load within their BA. It doesn't have any of the other features that RTOs would also have, including transmission planning, resource adequacy, and forward scheduling functions. So there are efforts underway to expand the energy balance market into a day-ahead market. And then the governance structure does include some non-California representatives, and there's kind of an interesting interplay between how the EIM governance structure and meeting operates, and then how the California Independent System Operator. So there's some merging of these different stakeholder organizations, which could indicate that there's some future for more politically feasible alignment in terms of governance of these RTO light. So the research question we're interested in here is, what are optimal and robust low carbon power system expansion planning decisions, given the fact that we have so many different state level clean energy policies, and we have many different degrees of potential regionalization, and the fact that states need to start planning now for 2050. You can't wait until all of this uncertainty is resolved in order to start planning, what's your transmission pathway going to look like, or where do you want to aim to prioritize building more wind and solar. So the model we're using here is a capacity expansion planning model, an optimization model. It's got a number of different components. It's pretty standard from a capacity expansion planning model standpoint, but I'll go through some of the details for folks that are less familiar. We have expansion decisions for new build resources, generation and transmission, as well as transmission upgrades, which I'll talk about. We have retirements. We also have dispatch and reserves from generators and storage units. We are considering unit commitment, which is how you turn on and off generators, but we're actually going to relax that to be a continuous decision variable. And we have non-served energy and transmission flow. So basically trying to take capacity expansion. So think about building new resources as well as various representative weeks in the year in order to meet demand at a least cost. Transmission lines are really key to the Western RTO and Western Regionalization project. And this is because Western resources are spread out quite a bit, demand centers as well as the good renewable resources. So, and yet it's actually can be quite challenging to build new transmission lines because of securing right-of-ways. There's a lot of federal land, protected land, and others. So it's not just open season to go build a transmission line wherever you want. So we're actually considering in this model upgrading and a lot of different upgrading options of existing transmission lines. Hence, we went out, collected the existing as well as the proposed transmission lines and those existing paths. And there are different ways depending on what the current voltage of the line is. So if it's 230 kV now, you could upgrade it to various higher AC voltages, as well as upgrading to a 500 kV DC line, which would give you lower losses over long distances. If you're kind of already at a 500 kV AC line, then you could upgrade just to 500 kV DC. And so there's a couple of different configurations, and we model each of these potentials. In terms of the zones we're interested in, we can't run it at the full nodal model. That wouldn't be computationally feasible. So what we do is we aggregate the Western US into 12 zones, that are indicated here by the different colors. So notably, we split up California into 3 different zones, but then we aggregate Oregon and Washington into one zone. And just for reference, so the dark zones here are where the EIM is already extended in terms of utility coverage. And then we're very interested in the regional coordination. So we can have a full RTO, but we might also be interested in looking at what are different configurations of coordination. And so in particular, we identify 3 key functions of an RTO. One is energy balancing. This can be served by an energy imbalance market, for example, that's sufficiently expanded to include, for example, day ahead if we're considering uncertainty. Reserve sharing. So do each of the individual balancing areas have to maintain their own backup generation to meet their own set of reserve requirements, or can they share reserves so that you can rely on an extra generator in a neighboring balancing area in case you have a sudden shortfall in your supply? And then resource adequacy planning. So this is also called reserve margins. This is trying to make sure you have sufficient generation on the grid in order to meet peak demand plus some margin. These in a fully uncoordinated rest, you would have each of the balancing areas having to create their own set of resource adequacy requirements. Each of the zones. So in this model, we can also think about what happens if you have a Western-wide resource adequacy requirement. The data we're using, a large part of the data comes from Power Genome, which was started co-led by one of your Princeton colleagues, Professor Jesse Jenkins, which includes a lot of detail on generators, capacity factors, loads, et cetera. We're also building on a California study that has some other more granular detail in terms of hydro and geothermal potential, as well as hurdle rates, which I'll get to in a second. And then we went out and we collected a lot more transmission lines data by various voltage, and then we also have transmission cost data to incorporate into our model for upgrading. So just to give you a snapshot of what this kind of looks like with transmission lines. So between each of the zones, we go out and we code, what voltage lines are connecting these two zones, which then tells us what are the upgrade options, and then what would be the cost of those, and the increased capacity as you move from low voltage to higher voltage. When we're thinking about these transmission costs, we actually have to be very careful about whether or not we're interested in fixed or variable costs with the transmission. So for this, we're incorporating both, which introduces a non-continuous component to the transmission cost expansion decision. So particularly, we're interested in the cost of actually, line, running the copper, the substation cost, so transformers, a variable transmission, a substation cost depending on the size of the transformer, and then right-of-way costs if we're building new lines. And so just as a comparison, so this, mini models, including Power Genome, will have kind of a linear, solely variable cost associated with transmission lines. With this kind of model, we would have a kind of upfront fixed cost associated with building substations and others, and then have a variable increase over time. So this would give you different results depending on what the capacity of the line, or the optimal capacity of the line ends up being. And then the most interesting feature here is thinking about the different scenarios for regionalization that we just talked about. So I'll stay here for just a second. So we have our baseline model, right? In our baseline model, we're assuming that we go out to 2050. We have something that's called a hurdle rate, which is that there's some kind of penalty or transaction cost that's associated with trading across balancing areas because you don't have this RTO single market. So you don't have a single market where everything is cleared together, and thus transactions costs are minimal. If you have all these different BAs, they have to go out and they have to sign contracts, they have to create other processes. There are other issues associated with potentially how transmission cost is allocated. So we have, all of these things are kind of lumped together into what's called a hurdle rate, which is used in a lot of different models to illustrate this lack of coordination in the energy balancing. The second is we're interested in operating reserves. So again, remember, reserves are, we need backup generation in order to meet, for example, any changes in forecasted supply or demand. So we could have operating reserve requirements that we have to meet just at the zonal level. So in each zone, each state has to have a certain amount of generation capacity just on standby just in case demand or renewable supply varies from the forecast. But we can also imagine meeting that regionally, right? So we can share operating reserves across different states. And then the last one is this planning reserve, the reserve margin, in order to meet peak demand over the year. And this is similar to the operating reserve in the sense that you can either have every balancing area have to meet its own set of planning reserve margins, or you can have the planning reserve margin shared across the whole region. So we have these three different scenarios, one we call baseline, one an expanded EIM, and then one is a regionalized scenario, RTO. And then we have two policy cases. One is a baseline where we just take those RPS and CES targets that we had in the previous slides out to 2050, kind of assuming that there's not much movement in those, which is, again, sort of a baseline, not necessarily the likely scenario. And then a policy scenario where we have 100% CES that needs to be met regionally. So we don't have any in-state requirements, but we have a regional CES that needs to be met by 2050. All right, so we'll get into the preliminary results here. So this is just the baseline model. And we're showing here is what solar and wind looks like in the various states and zones out to 2050. There's a lot of capacity needs to be built. So just some rough numbers, we're looking at close to 4 gigawatts of solar per year additions and over 1 gigawatt of wind per year additions in the West. We do have some significant solar, basically across the board. Wind is more concentrated in the high quality areas. Again, this is the baseline model where we're just doing state RPS targets. If we look at transmission path capacities, where do we want to build? Between which zones do we want to build new transmission or upgrade transmission? Blue here is the existing capacity. Orange is what we what we got from the literature in terms of proposed transmission, in terms of early and late stage, these are not finalized yet, but we have a sense that somehow those paths are more likely than a completely new path. So we incorporate those as kind of a default in this model. We could go back and we could take those out and kind of look at what if some of those lines don't pan out. And then we have all these different upgrade options from black up to purple. And as you can see, there's actually quite a bit of upgrading that takes place on some of these lines. And from different voltages, some going to AC, some going to DC. This is all determined by what's the most cost-effective given what the existing transmission pathway is, what their voltage are, and then what is the need in terms of balancing supply and demand over the system. If we look at what's happening to other resources, so this is the baseline model. So we're not 100% CES. So we still have some unabated fossil in this model, natural gas and coal in particular. But we're expecting to have lots of hydro in the Northwest as expected. We still have some coal out in Arizona and Wyoming, and a lot of natural gas around in order to meet various other firm load requirements. And then lots of storage. Solar needs lots of storage, and so we're building lots of storage, mostly nearby where the solar resources are. So a lot in Arizona and SoCal, Southern California, and some new pumped hydro based on what is left untapped in the region. And just to give you a little bit more of a sense of what this model is actually doing under the hood, this is one dispatch over the peak week in Arizona. And what we're looking at here is different generation resources. In particular, you can see here batteries being discharged to meet the evening peak, being charged during the peak solar period. So you have quite a bit of battery discharging, really strong need for these short duration batteries. And sort of a different kind of setup in Wyoming again, because there's more, Wyoming still has some unabated coal, with a lot of wind. And just in terms of curtailment rates, they vary quite a bit, but as you expect, solar curtailment rates are high where you have lots of solar on the system, like Arizona. All right, so now let's look at the different regionalization scenarios. So just to walk you through this, number one is the baseline case with just this current state policies. And then 2, 3, 4 all are 100% CES regional. So we're all trying to meet the same amount of clean energy resources, i.e. 100% to meet demand in 2050. And then 2, 3, 4 have those 3 different regionalization scenarios, starting from the no regional market to expanded EIM to a regionalized market. And a few things really pop out. One is that actually the difference between 2 and 4, right, which is the assumption of do you still have these kind of hurdle rates and you can't trade very effectively between balancing regions, and you have to meet reserves and reserve requirements as well as reserve margins just locally, to a fully regionalized market, that there actually is some difference in where you want to build solar and wind. So in particular, Arizona and Nevada, you have some strong differences as you change these different assumptions. And this kind of goes back to the implications of, it's important to think about what are the potential configurations of regionalization going forward. In terms of storage capacities, largely as we'd expect, right? If you're more reliant on transmission, you're probably going to need less storage. So if you're more effective at utilizing your transmission network, you don't need to build as much battery storage. The actual amount of transmission lines that we're building are pretty similar across. There's some small variations here we're still investigating, but largely the amount of transmission lines that we have are changed. So really what we're talking about is, do we have sufficient, are we using the transmission network effectively, taking into account all the other services it can provide, including reserves and resource adequacy. And then in terms of costs, as expected, the regional market is cheaper, lower cost than the non-regional market. And these numbers here, we'll have to check these numbers against some other different robustness specifications and maybe some different weak selection, but this is looking at around 500 million. I think probably the final numbers will be a little bit higher than that. And just thinking about robust decision, this is the last result slide here, is if you didn't know out to 2050, well, are we going to be in a regionalized scenario or are we going to be in a balancing area only scenario? Then what would be kind of the baseline of what you should be planning for? So this is the minimum of all the different capacities for solar, wind, and storage. And you see there still is quite a bit, right? We know that in SoCal, we're going to build a lot more solar and storage, kind of regardless of whatever scenario we're in. And similar for Northern California and New Mexico. We know in Wyoming, we want to build lots of wind, kind of regardless of how effectively we can use and regionalize this scenario. Importantly, we don't model intrastate transmission connections and capacities that we would need, for example, to access Wyoming resources if there were bottlenecks within the state. But this points away to what policymakers could potentially use in terms of planning kind of a no regrets scenario for how you would want to build out your system, given the uncertainties going forward in the markets and regionalization. All right, so let's talk through what these results mean. So first off, there is not significant policy alignment among these Western states of the WEC on even mid-century goals. Do we all want to reach carbon neutrality by the same year? What the clean energy targets are, as well as resource preferences. Some RPSs and clean energy targets would include nuclear, RPS wouldn't. Some RPSs have carve-outs where they have separate targets for wind and solar. Some have separate carve-outs for distributed utility, solar, et cetera. We have bulk power system kind of preferences, lots more transmission interconnection versus distributed generation, right? Do you want to rely upon these power lines that you might need to shut off if the wildfires are particularly risky, or do you want to build more expensive but more reliable distributed generation resources? We don't have alignment along those. You just have to look at the various net metering policies in the states to understand that there is quite a bit of difference of opinions in terms of how much we want to incentivize distributed generation. Governance structures for regional coordination on energy and climate. So some utilities are part of now this EIM where they're participating in these governance structures. But the 11 states aren't getting together and agreeing on a regional climate strategy, right? So there's some states have more alignment than others. What we're really interested in looking forward is, so we know that these regionalizations matter to total costs and the type of resource that we build, but what determines whether the jurisdictions are going to coordinate? Historically, if you just look to where the RTOs have been formed out east at first, those were largely utility-led processes where utilities got together and penciled it out and said, okay, it's more cost-effective for us to join this RTO and give up some autonomy, but we get lower costs and we have savings along the way. But we also know state governments and regulatory authorities have a say in this, and they may prefer to retain more of their autonomy rather than give it up to a regionalized body, particularly one that may be governed by a different state or dominated by a different state. There's, of course, incidence on other stakeholders. So think about consumers. Electricity prices are going to change when you create a more effective single market. Renewable energy developers, huge constituency, thinking about, are they primarily utility? Are they distributed? Do they want to access resources outside of state? Do they also want to build storage? And then does political partisan alignment have anything to do with this, right? Do the states that are more aligned politically in the same party in the governor's office, for example, does that have a strong determining factor over where these jurisdictions are going to coordinate? So we started doing some preliminary state level scoring on regionalization positions of the various states in the WEC. And we find there's quite a bit of mixed support, right? There's some that are more supportive. Notably California, which would be kind of the linchpin of a regional RTO because it's the largest demand center. Even within California, positions are mixed, right? We've had some preference for, and lots of studies undertaken to look at the effects of RTO, but not necessarily a really strong political signal from the state and the regulatory agencies and others that would say, okay, this is definitely going to go ahead. There still are a lot of mixed views, somewhat along potentially on the governance angle, and then maybe on the other incidence and autonomy preferences. So just wrapping up here, we have a state level capacity expansion planning model for the Western US, and we considered some transmission upgrades at a very granular level, as well as regionalization scenarios that incorporate a wide range of potential political alignments into the future. We show that you would need to have massive solar and wind build out to 2050. This is not surprising. A lot of other studies say this. But because we're incorporating upgrades of existing transmission infrastructure, we can actually identify some of those potential very low cost ways of upgrading that may not be included if we're only considering new builds. Regional coordination can affect where we'd want to optimally build solar and storage and wind, right? If we can take advantage of some of the sharing of reserves, reserve margins and energy balancing, that can change where we'd optimally deploy it. It doesn't seem like there's a big impact on transmission as much. Total costs, as I said, do change as we'd expect. They might change a little bit more with some different robustness specifications, but they're not huge, right? But that's not to say that the regional coordination doesn't matter, because it does affect the deployment pattern. So if you're planning for a non-regionalized scenario and you end up with regionalized, then you may actually end up with a less optimal mix than if you were planning for the correct one. And if we think about what is maybe more robust to different future political uncertainties around regional coordination, most of the network upgrade opportunities seem to be largely robust. We just basically want to upgrade all of these old 230 kV lines as much as we can. We also going to want to deploy solar and storage, particularly near large demand centers like Southern California, where we know we have really good sun and we know storage can help meet peak load. And that's kind of regardless of how much other transmission or how cheap resources are in other parts of the region. We still know we want to do that, somewhat robust to these other decisions. So this points a way for policymakers to think through what are some decisions, some no regrets decisions that we want to make now as we think through planning for 2050 long-term decarbonization goals. So with that, I'll stop here and I'll take any questions, Denise.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. That was a terrific talk. There's some questions that are coming in. To give people another minute or so to ask some questions. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the transmission build out that you described, because I noticed that there is actually relatively little high voltage DC lines indicated by your modeling efforts. And as you know, of course, China is building a lot of very high voltage DC lines. And I was just wondering why that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, well, part of the reason is that there actually are a lot of other upgrade options for some of these low voltage AC to just go to other AC lines. And DC lines, yeah, it is interesting. DC lines have an advantage over long distances, right? So there's kind of a trade-off where, because you have to build these two converter stations, those are really large fixed costs. And so the economics for doing a DC over an AC only pencil out if you're kind of very long distances. So if you were building a shorter line, you might build AC, particularly if that line was already kind of a low voltage AC, and you can get a big bump in your capacities by just moving up to a higher voltage AC. I don't know if that answered your question.
You think there's just not that many really long distance transmission lines that are expected to be built, and therefore the high voltage DC is less cost effective and is less likely to be built? Is that what you're finding?
So I think the distances really matter. So you'll see here, the only DC line we have here is going from NorCal to Pacific Northwest. So that's a very large distance.
Yeah.
And I will say that some of these, we're taking the centroids of these regions. So of course, if you took a very, more detailed nodal transmission map, you might end up with some longer lines or shorter lines that could change these specifications a little bit. But I think what we're finding is that largely upgrading AC lines can be quite cost effective. Mm-hmm. And as you shift from so you're worried mostly about what your right of way is as you go from low voltage to higher voltage, because you basically what you're saving is not having to go out and get new land. You're just replacing the towers and lines within that particular right of way. And so that can be very cost effective. And I think we're identifying that that's a pretty robust decision. I think that we could definitely explore some different scenarios here about under what conditions might you see a much larger DC build out. I think that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So from the questions that have come in, Professor Rob Socolow asks or mentions that there are two issues that seem to have powerful implications for siting: how Native American reservations and how military weapons testing regions are evaluated. In Princeton's Net Zero America project, both were essentially screened out for solar power. How are these national issues intersecting regional planning? And what should we aspire to put in place? Are these minor or major issues going forward? And Rob, do you want to elaborate a bit on your question? Or perhaps, Michael, if you want to go ahead, and then he might chime in if he has some follow-up comments.
That's a great question, Rob. So we're looking at this at a state level. So we have resource profiles for example, wind and solar, again, from the Power Genome database, which would tell us, how many clusters of wind and solar per state, per zone, and what's their resource profile look like? How much capacity can you build in each of those? So we're relying on that here because we're mostly interested in this kind of state level balancing. I do have separate work where I am doing more of a detailed resource assessment, where we are thinking about, okay, all the different land use screening, if we can only build in certain locations, how does that change the available supply curve for wind and solar? And yes, it matters quite a bit, right? Particularly in the Western United States, where you think you have all this available land, but actually a lot of the land is not available or easy to be used to deploy renewables. So you are going to end up with some very important and sticky trade-offs as you think through these questions. And I think a really important question right now for California decision makers is, given how difficult this planning process is, what can we reasonably expect from other states in terms of what kinds of resources they're going to build out? Can we really rely upon getting so much wind from Wyoming? How do we need to think about where we can build transmission lines that are going to be robust to these different uncertainties over siting? Because ultimately, siting considerations are taken, not at a regional level, but at a state and much more local level, as you pointed out. So I think it's a really good question. I think
Michael, am I audible? Denise, am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hi, Rob. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. Because these are both federal issues, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I think, or whatever it is, and the military, we have another layer here. And in both cases, there's a high moral component to the thinking. We think of a Native American reservation as a place that should be protected from the intrusions of solar, or assured access to its fair share of the jobs and revenue of solar. And who thinks that through? One of the things I learned from the Net Zero America project is just how much that will be a factor in Western lands. When it comes to bombing ranges, are we ready to give up some bombing ranges for solar panels? These are to me actually fascinating questions that are not getting more micro, but actually getting more macro. It's the DoD that's going to make decisions like that.
Yeah, macro. Right? Rob, I think it's a great point. I think macro in terms of the governance structure, but actually extremely micro in terms of the models you would need to capture that. Because at this level, what we're doing is we're aggregating clusters over a whole state, right? We're not getting down to that. Of course, that's derived from a more bottom-up model that would take a look at what land use is available. But we're working on now in a separate study is what are these different land use screenings that you would have in different contexts? So in China and India and the Western US, and considering all of those, how does changing that screening kind of criteria affect the supply curves, which then go into these models, right? So it's kind of an upstream
Right.
thing that I think is
But
really
with standards, both in Arizona and Nevada, it's a substantial fraction of the land. It's not a 10% effect. So how does the state thinking about this part of its land use?
Yeah, I think that those are all really great questions. Yeah, lots more work to do.
Great. Here's a question from a graduate student, Rohit Gupta. Are there any contractual obligations of utilities with generators, for example, that might be an obstacle in regionalization? And Rohit, if you want to elaborate, feel free.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Professor, for such a lovely talk. I was just wondering that this is the problem which we are facing in India, where the federal government wants to get the scheduling of the electricity market done at the regional or at the national level, but then the states have their own power purchase agreements with generators, and it has been, and it's hard to figure out how to compensate for these, for the winners and losers in a uncertain kind of future. So I was wondering if that is a problem here as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was actually going to pull up the utility slide here. So we have all of these different balancing areas, and then within balancing areas, we have utilities. States set their own set of requirements on how much utilities need to contract ahead of time. So in California, basically utilities need to have some kind of contractual obligation for most of their power, right? And in advance in order to meet various resource adequacy and flexible resource adequacy requirements. So that means that a lot of renewables, for example, is contracted ahead of time. That does have an impact here, right? Because if you're utility, you go out and you sign a contract with a generator that's not in your area, you need to make sure that you have some available transmission capacity. And so all of these things are linked. That level of detail is really hard to capture in this type of model, though. And I think that's why a lot of these things, these types of models typically will aggregate that into this hurdle rate, which just says, okay, what is the cost associated with getting power kind of outside of your region, thinking about the transaction costs and others. I think this is a great corollary to what we see in India, right? In India, you have different types of generators, interstate generators and state level generators, and they are actually treated very differently in the regulatory structure, right? In fact, the extent that they're even regulated, the transactions and contracts that they sign are regulated by different entities, even though they may be in the same state right next to each other. And that really is complicated to think through. And in the case of India, I would say that probably these regionalization measures are going to be very important, if not more important than the West, because of how difficult interstate trading is, how rigid interstate trading is currently.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Another graduate student, Ned Downey, asks, what types of long duration storage resources do you include in your 100% CES scenario? Do you have any long duration batteries? And Ned, if you want to add anything, feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I was just curious, and I apologize if I missed that, but whether that's something that's in there, and if so, whether that would be something that might affect the sort of high-level results that you're finding about where stuff gets expanded where.
Yeah, Ned, it's a great question. So with this type of model, what we're doing is we're selecting several representative weeks over the year. And then we model each of those kind of on its own, right? So we assume like you're running this week and you have this week and these 2 weeks are disconnected. So the model that's currently structured wouldn't be able to capture, okay, we need to store this power for a certain number of hours in order to meet this week, because we're assuming we're modeling them as representative of several weeks throughout the year. So there's not a direct connection for how long they would be storing from 1 week to the next. So we model batteries and pumped hydro. In order to effectively measure that long duration storage, you'd have to have these longer, more coupled weeks. That would, of course, increase the complexity of your model, probably make it so we couldn't solve the transmission upgrading model, which introduces a lot of binary variables to the problem. So there's some key trade-offs here. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to explore, if we relax some of these other parts of the model and we put in more long duration, would our results substantially change? I mean, previous results obviously show that having very low cost long duration storage can be a key factor, but it has to be very low cost to really make a big dent in the future structure of the power systems.
Okay. Jonathan Allen asks, do you include nuclear among low carbon sources?
Yeah, so we do a 100% CES scenario, meaning that nuclear would be included in those, included in the available resources. Yeah.
And so how important is that in terms of, and Jonathan, if you want to add anything else, please do, but how important is that in stabilizing the grid and addressing storage issues if you can rely on this baseload power?
The reason why I asked about nuclear is that it's a bit controversial for some people, yet it, given the much more serious threat of climate change, a lot of people have become more tolerant of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, John. I think we have to think about, do we want to build exclusively, renewable energy powered systems, or we want to have clean energy sources, including potentially carbon capture and storage, as well as nuclear and others. Generally speaking, having more technologies available to you reduces the cost. That makes kind of intuitive sense. We do know that right now, we should expect to try to keep our nuclear plants online as long as we can, because they provide a really valuable service to the grid. And they're already, particularly the ones that are already built, they're already very low cost in order to continue to run them. And you can't really expect that nuclear plants would be able to be phased out, and a lot of renewables and storage could be brought in and at a low cost way in order to meet what our clean energy goals are. I think we need to be thinking about this very carefully in the context of California. But this is looking out very far in the future, right? 2050, where all of the existing would have been retired. So then we'd be very sensitive to assumptions over what are the costs of new nuclear going forward, right? We don't have a very good track record in this country for building nuclear on time and on budget. But going out to 2050, you can imagine having lots of new generation nuclear technologies. We don't run those sensitivities here in this model, but I think it's a really interesting question to explore.
And actually, Jonathan also asks, what are the losses in AC/DC AC conversion?
Yeah, we do not model transmission losses in this model. That's an important thing that we need to consider going forward. Losses can be incorporated if you incorporate them in certain ways, like, they would be quadratic, which makes the model a lot more difficult to solve. So we'd have to simplify this with some kind of linear approximation, and we can incorporate that. But generally speaking, you're looking at, DC losses over really long transmission lines of less than 5%. So, they can matter, but they usually aren't going to substantially change the results of the model.
Okay. Wilson Ricks asks, how did you choose the hurdle rates, and what are the major real life costs of trading between markets? And Wilson, if you want to expand, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's essentially it. I'm just curious about the, whether you actually, there's any real world data where you can actually measure the increase in, market efficiency between RTO and non-RTO scenarios, and how you include that in your modeling. Yeah,
it's a great question, Wilson. So in this model, we took the numbers from CEC directly, California Energy Commission, when they, in their SB 100 study. So they have their set of numbers that then they give out to modeling groups and say, okay, use these assumptions. And they're basically tied to what's the exporting region, right? If you're exporting from a certain region outside of that region to another region, here's an additional penalty that you have to account for that transaction cost. Those numbers are really fickle. I don't particularly like it, but it is a very common way of addressing these issues. I would prefer to go the route of Rohit, which is like actually incorporate the institutions and the transactions that are constraining, right? But that makes the model very, very difficult to solve. I'm hoping, and this is an area that potentially we could look at further with incorporating more of the political economy and the institutions in these models, is thinking about, okay, is there a middle ground here where we could come up with something more realistic than just a flat adder to every, megawatt hour that we're transmitting from one region to another? Because, we would expect that if you had planned the transaction a long time in advance, that's a lot easier to handle than if all of a sudden you need a lot of extra power from a neighboring region. Also, if that other region is facing some similar scarcity issues or other types of considerations, maybe it's more difficult to find a generator cell to you than in other cases. I think these are all really interesting questions. We don't have really good ways of modeling those in these yet. So that's maybe a topic for a PhD student.
Good idea. Sambhuta Chakrabarty asks about how detailed are your operations, and do you want to go ahead and elaborate on your question?
Hi, yes. Sorry, I have some logistics issue. I'm not being able to show my face, but first of all, thanks, Michael. It's a great talk. So basically what I wanted to know, as I wrote up in here, is how detailed, like, your operations model, like, are you solving a full-blown OPF? Like, I know that you have mentioned that you're resorting to the more like the zonal models. I'm assuming you're not probably having a node by node entire blown out network model, which is fine. But even in the reduced zonal model, are you solving like OPF? Are you considering N-1 contingencies, line flow limit? And also, are you simulating the day ahead and real-time models with the energy ancillary services? And then the second part of the question is, are you pulling all those operational data from Power Genome as well? If you're simulating a detailed, OPF to the extent you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sambhuta. Yeah, I think if I put everything that you wanted to in the model, then we would never solve it. So we have, of course, had to make some decisions here. So zonal model, no OPF, right? We're assuming a transport flow model. It's not really realistic to have an OPF laid on top of a highly aggregated zonal model, because what would you choose for all the different line parameters? And there's a lot more flexibility because you'd have to know, where the generators are within the zone, and that would affect quite substantially what the angles are across the zone. So generally speaking, when I have aggregated zonal models, I'm not going to use an OPF. I'll just use a transport flow model. We don't have N-1 contingencies, right? That would make it more challenging to solve, of course. Line limits are just based on what we got from the Power Genome, as well as what we found in our existing studies, existing transmission lines, and based on voltages, et cetera. Other operational details. I mean, I guess those are mostly network questions that you're asking, but in terms of other operational details, we have unit commitment that's relaxed, clustered with linear, continuous variables, and then all the other typical generation reserves, et cetera, operational ramp constraints that we would have for each of the representative weeks.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, and it's a question actually that I sort of have as well, from Colin Hickey. He says he wants to ask about the cost comparison estimates. The difference between the costs are fairly small, about 500 million or something like that out of 46 billion. A few percentage points here or there in certain costs or material prices over the coming years could cover that whole gap. So I wonder if they think that from a decision theoretic standpoint, it'll always dominate, or might there be some cost variation that would mean the regional route doesn't come out on top. And I was definitely also struck that it didn't look like the costs were that different between your three scenarios. And how much uncertainties are there in those cost estimates, and what might be the big factors that might move them in different directions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I guess what I was, so first off, yes, the costs seem to be slightly closer to each other because, again, the model is kind of optimizing for whatever structure it is. So I think the point here is that, yes, you can have some overall savings, but because you can kind of re-optimize based on your eventual market structure, you may find a different way of solving, the problem, which would involve completely changing where you want to build, wind, solar, and batteries. So I think that's the part that I wanted to hit home here, which is that, yes, the costs, if we can optimize for each of these things, may not differ too much, but we need to know what we're planning for in order to plan for the optimal of it. And if we don't know what situation we're going to be in, then that puts us in a trickier position where we may end up be optimizing for the wrong system and the wrong market configuration. So that's why I wanted to think more about what are the robust decisions that you would do kind of regardless of what the future market configuration is. And then we could think back, we could take it step back and say, okay, well, and what additional variation might you see depending if you are kind of looking for different eventualities that have very similar costs. This is kind of related, but a related, I think, mentality to the modeling for generating alternatives approach, which is trying to find, maximally different models that produce very similar results. In this case, we're finding that there are some very different results with some similar costs, but that have very different assumptions in terms of how the markets are coordinated. And I think this is kind of a different approach to think through, what would we want to build, given what we know about how coordinated the region is going to be going forward.
Okay, great. That makes sense. Thank you so much for your really important work and for your excellent talk. We appreciate your coming to see us virtually and hope to see you in person sometime.
Yeah, I would love to.
Great. Well, we'll try and make that happen then. In the meantime, thank you again. And I know various people at Princeton are looking forward to meeting you one-on-one.
Yes, it was great. Thanks so much for the invitation, Denise.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Okay. Bye, everyone.